Be they stalwart protectors clad in plate, powerful druids shapeshifted into towering bears, elusive monks, or mighty demon hunters, the tank is the character that protects their friends. But how do you tank? Well, let me show you. Hello there and welcome to the Tanking Guide. Over this series of videos we'll discuss everything you need to know to become a master tank. In the last lesson we learned about surviving as a tank. We discovered how passive mitigation adds a layer of survivability, how important active mitigation abilities make tanks even more difficult to kill, and how cooldowns help a tank survive incredibly dangerous situations. We even practiced surviving on our own against a training dummy. So now that we understand the basic concepts of tanking, threat, and survival, let's discuss how controlling your enemies will make your life, and the life of your friends, much easier. It's important to note that, as a tank, your role goes beyond just keeping enemies' attention on you and surviving that attention. Those aspects of tanking are only a part of the overall goal, and that goal is control. Try to get that into your head as we begin this lesson. A tank's role is to control the situation, and there are a number of aspects working against you in this regard, vying for control of any given moment. Now, let's get started. So let's start by discussing what control actually is. It sounds cool and all, but what is it and how does it relate to you as a tank? Well, control takes many forms, but generally a tank that has mastered the art of control will tank enemies in a certain way, gathering them into clusters for their damage dealers while simultaneously facing them away from their team in a safe location that prevents more enemies from getting involved. They'll also lower the damage that enemies do by controlling them with stuns, snares, and movement. The tank wrangles the enemies, basically, controlling how they move, giving their damage dealers the best possible situation for their damaging abilities, and making their healer's life easier by taking less damage. We'll go over these concepts one at a time, but before we do that, let's discuss what aspects of World of Warcraft will be trying to take control away from you. An unprepared tank can be taken by surprise by some of these, and it can lead to a loss of control. Loss of control means that generally you're going to be taking more damage, maybe enemies aren't in the right place, someone gets clipped by an ability that they shouldn't have, and things start falling apart. Even if the tank has threat on everything, if they can't control the situation, they and everyone around them will suffer. So, the first thing vying against control of a situation are your enemies. They'll be trying to kill you, naturally, but they'll also be doing things that reduce or even remove your control of a situation. Some enemies have conal attacks that can destroy players who aren't tanks, other enemies may have nasty abilities that disable you or your team, and some enemies may be completely untankable thanks to the fact that they ignore threat tables. It's important that you work to compensate for these enemies and do all that you can to keep them from controlling the situation. The next force vying against your control is your own team. As a tank, you will be working with anywhere between 4 to 39 other players, each of which is situated somewhere in the world, doing their own thing, and regardless of how much you communicate with them, their actions will have an effect on your ability to control the situation. Sometimes this will be good, sometimes this will be bad. They may be in the wrong place at the wrong time and get attacked by nearby foes who are not originally involved in the fight. This is called aggroing an enemy. They may purposefully attack more enemies that you aren't fighting, they may stand in nasty ground effects, or they might simply be toxic and rude. The last force vying against your ability to control the situation is the environment. You may not realize it, but where you're fighting your enemies is very important. If you fight a group of enemies while a wall or a flight of stairs blocks line of sight to your team, they're all going to struggle, and you may even be putting yourself in danger. A healer can't heal you if they can't see you. If their character is not in line of sight of yours, their spells will not work. And of course, if you're not being healed, you're in danger. And finally, of course, if you die, you've entirely lost control of the situation. So it's important that you consider how all of these forces that vie against your control work. Okay, so those are the things that you need to consider about how you can lose control. Now let's discuss how you can retain it and keep everything under control for you and your team, starting with your enemies. The biggest aspect of controlling your enemies is by positioning them in the right kind of way. Every enemy is different, but there are some basic guidelines for positioning enemies in the right place. You can position your enemies by moving your character. As long as you have threat on them and they can follow you, they will. If you backpedal by pressing the S key, or the back arrow key, then they will move with you. If you strafe by holding two directions at once, they'll try to guess where you're moving and move at a much faster pace. It's a bit more complex than that, but those are the general rules when it comes to your character moving and the enemy responding to it. So by using your movement, you can position your enemies. Often it's best to move in slow bursts so that you don't run too far away, making ranged enemies stand still and hit you with their ranged attacks. If you move slower, they'll always be in melee range, which means they'll move to stay in melee range. The general guidelines for positioning enemies are as such. First of all, you want them to be facing away from the group. This counteracts enemies that have conal attacks, like a dragon that breathes fire in a cone, or a spearman that swings their weapon in front of them, and other nasty effects that only a tank should be hit by. Just beware of enemies with long tails, like dragons, because they will usually, but not always, have a tail swipe attack that will hit enemies behind them. In these situations, you'll want to face their side towards the group. Good example of this is the second to last boss in the Iron Docks, O'Shea. He has an ability where he jumps backwards and then charges forwards, swiping madly. If you're facing him away from the group, then he'll jump into them and then start swiping. So you want him to be facing sideways to the group, so that he just kind of does his thing and the group doesn't have to move. On top of this, by facing enemies away from the group, those enemies will not be able to parry melee damage dealers, since enemies can't parry attacks from behind. This increases the damage that your group deals. Even if you don't have any melee damage dealers in your group, allowing the rest of your group the luxury of not having to worry about enemy position lets them focus on dealing damage and healing. Almost everyone suffers if they have to move, so the less that your team has to move because of enemies, the better. It's also important to note that by having enemies attacking you from in front of you, you will take less damage thanks to your passive mitigation, which otherwise won't trigger if you're being attacked from behind. So, we're facing enemies away from the team and towards us, but what else can we do with positioning enemies to control them? Well, one of the best things you can do when it comes to positioning is to ensure that all of the enemies you're fighting are as clumped up as possible. There are exceptions to this, but in general you'll want groups of enemies as close together as possible, allowing area of effect abilities to hit them all. This also makes your life easier as well, as your multiple target abilities can hit more enemies. There are, however, some difficult situations you will encounter where enemies don't want to move. Perhaps they're a ranged enemy that don't really move at all, or they're constantly casting spells instead of moving to you, or they just can't move. In these situations, you have three options. The first is to force them to come to you with a movement ability, and this option is only really available to Death Knights using Death Grip or Gorfiend's Grasp. The second option is to identify and stop what they're doing that's stopping them from moving. For instance, if you're fighting an enemy constantly casting spells, interrupting them with Mind Freeze, Skull Bash, Spear Hand Strike, Rebuke, or Pummel will prevent them from casting spells of that school for a few seconds. If they can't cast spells, they'll usually just run at you and attack you with their melee attacks. Then they're in range and you're all good. But what if even this doesn't work? What if you're fighting an enemy immune to being moved or interrupted? These are awkward situations, but there is a solution to that too. You can simply designate the ranged enemy as the point where you're going to position the enemies. Then, the ranged enemy is part of the clump of foes anyway. This won't always work, and sometimes there's very little you can do to stop a ranged enemy from sitting outside of the group of enemies, but you should do your utmost to keep them controlled and, if possible, move the group of enemies to them so that you have a good clump. There's one final trick here, and it pertains to the environment. The same walls and stairs that block your healer's line of sight, you can use to block the enemy's line of sight to you. If they can't attack you, they will move into a position where they can attack. So, you can use this to your advantage by moving behind walls or stairs for a moment to force enemies to move towards you. Just note, if the enemy is rooted to the floor because of an ability or because that's just what they are, then this won't work, and they'll attack someone else, as we discussed in the threat lesson, so be careful about that. Now, a quick mention of positioning yourself. It's important that you're not in a position where you'll aggro new enemies by accident, and so that you're not out of range of your healers or your damage dealers. Keep an eye on where your group is, so that you're not by yourself, that your group is, actually still with you. Also, keep in mind that a lot of large enemies have knockback abilities, so positioning yourself against a wall or away from a nasty drop is always a good idea. Up next, positioning your group. This is actually fairly simple if you can get this concept into your head. You are in charge. It's that simple. You may be surrounded by people who are more confident than you, who have better gear, or who are more experienced, But you are the tank, and 9 times out of 10, it is you that decides when to begin a fight, and you are always in control of the enemies you are tanking. Even if you don't have leader of a group, you're in charge. As discussed earlier, if you move, your enemy will move. But if you move enemies out of range of your group is naturally going to move as well. You can use this to dictate the pace at which your group fights enemies, and you can even use it to move the group out of hazardous places. If you're fighting enemies and you're concerned about your group accidentally pulling more, you can move the enemies you're in combat with away from the danger zone, and the group will have to move with you or they'll go out of range and be useless, and no damage dealer or healer wants to be useless. Similarly, if a foe puts nasty stuff like fire or poison on the ground near you, you can move yourself and the enemy to make melee damage dealers move. If they don't notice the bad stuff on the ground themselves, which let's be honest, most of them won't, they'll notice your enemy moving and then chase after them. Using this strategy, you can control the group's movement. It does somewhat resemble you and the enemy as a carrot on a stick and everyone's just following you, but that's really what the nature of it is. There are, of course, exceptions to this, and we'll talk more about wrangling a group and dealing with difficult players in a future video. It's quite the topic, so let's wrap up instead. Finally, let's talk about how you can control your enemies directly. Even a tank has means with which to control their foes, either by interrupting them, as discussed earlier, silencing them, stunning them, or other similar effects. This is another big thing to think about. Stuns are a tank's best friend. If an enemy can be stunned, then stunning them effectively takes them out of the fight for the duration of the stun, and that's great for you. Spells like Remorseless Winter, Mighty Bash, Leg Sweep, Hammer of Justice, or Shockwave are examples of spells that can stun enemies, and you should consider using these on groups of enemies as you engage them to keep them in place while you build threat and get into position, or as a means to keep them still if they're attempting to run away. You can even use it when you feel like you're losing control of spellcasters, or if you or the group is taking too much damage. If you stun an entire group of enemies, they're not hitting you. You have time to regenerate health for the healer to do their thing. So stuns are amazing. They are your best friend. You also have to think about crowd control abilities. These are spells that disable enemies for an extremely long time, normally around a minute or so, but that break when the enemy takes damage. Spells like this are Polymorph, Hex, Sap, things like that. Positioning yourself and the enemies so that you and your team don't break the crowd control will help your survivability and prevent you from having to deal with extra enemies until the crowd control is done. Just beware that as of the release of this video, players don't really use crowd control very much, and as a tank you won't really have access to crowd control spells. So this is something that you can look out for, but don't be surprised if someone else breaks crowd control spells. Don't let that take you by surprise. Using disabling spells like stuns and crowd control will make your life easier, because if an enemy can't do anything, they're completely under control, which, as we mentioned at the start of this lesson, is your goal as a tank. This is, of course, something that everyone has to think about. Remember that you aren't in this alone. Every class has a way of controlling enemies through stuns, interrupts, slows, crowd control, and more. It's not entirely on you to control the situation, but most of the responsibility lies with you, so you must be prepared. As always, teamwork is the best way to make your life easier, and working together is how successful players take on the nastiest fights in the game and win.
Yes! Yes! Very nice, guys.
That will conclude this lesson about control. We learned about the importance of control, what can cause us to lose control of situations, what we can do to position ourselves, our team, and our enemies, and how we can use disabling abilities in order to maximize our control. In our next lesson, we'll discuss your rotation, going over basic ability usage for every class so that you can contribute meaningful damage to your team, which does help, while simultaneously remaining at the height of your survivability. Thank you very much for watching. If you have any questions, thoughts, comments or suggestions, you can contact me using the links in the description, or you can just leave a comment. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I wish you the best of luck in the world of Warcraft.